Pippi Longstocking, Book 2, Chapter 5, Pippi Goes to the Fair. Once every year, a fair was held in the little town, and all the children were simply wild with joy that anything so nice could happen. The town looked quite different on fair day. There were big crowds in the streets, flags were flying, and in the marketplace were booths where you could buy the most wonderful things. There was so much commotion that it was exciting just to walk in the streets. Best of all, down by the city gate, there was a carnival with a merry-go-round and shooting galleries and a tent show and all kinds of things. And there was a menagerie with wild animals, tigers and giant snakes and monkeys and trained seals. You could stand outside the menagerie and hear the strangest growling and roaring you ever heard in all your life. And if you had money, you could, of course, go in and see everything too. No wonder that even the bow in Annika's hair trembled with excitement when she had finished dressing on the morning of the fair, or that Tommy swallowed his cheese sandwich almost whole. Tommy and Annika's mother had asked them if they didn't want to go to the fair with her, but they squirmed and wiggled and said if she didn't mind, they would rather go with Pippi. For you see, explained Tommy to Annika as they ran through the garden gate at Villa Villacuela, I think more funny things will happen where Pippi is. Annika thought so too. Pippi was all dressed up and standing right in the middle of the kitchen floor waiting for them. She had at last found her big cartwheel hat in the woodshed. I forgot that I used it to carry wood in the other day, she said, and pulled the hat down over her eyes. Don't I look nice? Tommy and Annika had to admit that she did. She had blackened her eyebrows with a piece of charcoal and had painted her lips and her nails red. And then she had put on a very fine evening dress that reached to the floor. It was cut low in the back and showed her red flannel underwear. Her big black shoes stuck out from under her skirt, and they were even finer than usual, for she had tied on them the big green rosettes that she wore only on special occasions. I think one should look like a really fine lady when one goes to the fair, she said, and she tripped down the road as daintily as was possible in such big shoes. She lifted up the edge of her skirt and, holding it away from her, said in a voice that didn't sound at all like her own, "Charming, charming." "What is it that's so charming?" asked Tommy. "Me," said Pippi happily. Tommy and Annika thought that everything was charming when there was a fair in town. It was charming to mingle with the crowd and to go from one booth to another on the square and to look at all the things displayed there. Pippi bought a red silk scarf for Annika as a souvenir of the fair, and for Tommy a visor cap, which he had always longed for, but which his mother didn't want him to have. In another booth, Pippi bought 2 glass bells filled with pink and white candies. "Oh, how kind you are, Pippi," said Annika, hugging her bell. "Oh, yes, charming, charming," said Pippi, lifting her skirt gracefully. A stream of people moved slowly down the street from the square to the carnival. Pippi, Tommy, and Annika went along. "Gee, isn't this great?" said Tommy. The organ grinder played, the merry-go-round went round and round, the people laughed joyously. The dart throwing and china breaking were in full swing. People crowded around the shooting galleries to show their skill. "I'd like a closer look at that," said Pippi, and pulled Tommy and Annika with her to the shooting gallery. Just then, there was no one in that particular gallery, and the lady who was supposed to be handing out shooters and taking in money was cross. She didn't think 3 children would make very good customers, and so she paid no attention to them. Pippi looked at the target with great interest. It was a cardboard man with a round face, dressed in a blue coat. Right in the middle of his face was a red nose, which you were supposed to hit. If you couldn't hit his nose, you should at least come close to it. Shots that didn't hit his face weren't counted. It annoyed the lady to see the children standing there. She wanted customers who could both shoot and pay. "Are you still hanging around here?" said Pippi. "Are you still hanging around here?" said the lady angrily. "No," said Pippi seriously. "We're sitting in the middle of the square, cracking nuts." "What are you glaring at?" asked the lady, still more angrily. "Are you waiting for someone to come and shoot?" "No," said Pippi. We're waiting for you to start turning somersaults." Just then a customer came up, a very fine gentleman with a big gold chain over his stomach. He took one of the shooters and weighed it in his hand. "I think I'll take a few shots just to show how it's done," he said. He looked around to see if he had any audience, but there was no one except Pippi, Tommy, and Annika. "Look here, children," he said, "watch me and I'll give you your first lesson in the art of shooting." He lifted the gun to his cheek. The first shot was way off, the second shot also, and the third and the fourth were still farther from the nose. The fifth shot hit the cardboard man on the bottom of his chin. "This gun's no good," said the fine gentleman and threw it down. Pippi picked it up and loaded it. My, how well you shoot," she said. "Another time I'll shoot just as you taught us, but not like this." Pang, 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 pang. 5 shots had hit the cardboard man right in the middle of his nose. Pippi gave the lady a gold piece and walked off. The merry-go-round was so marvelous that Tommy and Annika held their breath in awe when they saw it. There were black and white and brown wooden horses to ride on. They had real manes and tails and looked almost alive. They also had saddles and reins. Hold on, one of my friends is coming back in. All right. They also had saddles and reins. You could choose any horse you wanted. Pippi bought a whole gold pieces worth of tickets. She got so many, there was hardly room for them in her big purse. "If I had given them another gold coin, I think I would have got the whole whirly thingamajig," she said to Tommy and Annika, who stood waiting for her. Tommy decided on a black horse, and Annika took a white one. Pippi placed Mr. Nilsson on a black horse that looked very wild. Mr. Nilsson immediately began to scratch the horse's mane to see if it had fleas. "Is Mr. Nilsson going to ride the merry-go-round too?" asked Annika, surprised. "Of course," said Pippi. "If I'd thought about it, I would have brought my horse too." He really needed a bit of entertainment, and a horse who rides on a horse, that would have been really horsey. Pippi threw herself into the saddle of a brown horse, and the next second the merry-go-round started, and the music played the song, "Do You Remember Our Childhood Days with All Their Jolly Fun?" Here is a beautiful picture of Annika on her white horse, Tommy on the black one. Ooh, the black one looks like it has a purple mane. And Pippi looks like she's standing on her head on another one. Can we see it? Can we see the whole picture? Yeah. Love that. Tommy and Annika thought it was wonderful to ride the merry-go-round, and Pippi looked as though she were enjoying herself too. She stood on her head on her horse with her legs straight up in the air. Her long evening dress fell down around her neck. The people who were watching saw only a red flannel shirt and a pair of green pants, Pippi's long, thin legs with one black and one brown stocking, and her large black shoes playfully waving back and forth. "That's the way a really fine lady rides the merry-go-round," exclaimed Pippi at the end of the first ride. But the children rode the merry-go-round for a whole hour. But at last Pippi was dizzy and said that she saw 3 merry-go-rounds instead of only 1. "It's so hard to decide which one to ride on," she said. "So I think we'll go some other place." She had a whole lot of tickets left, and these she gave to some children who hadn't ridden at all because they didn't have any money for tickets. Outside a tent nearby, a man was shouting, "New show starts in 5 minutes. Don't miss this wonderful opportunity to see The Murder of the Countess Aurora, or Who's Sneaking Around in the Bushes. Right this way, folks, right this way for the big show. If there's someone sneaking around in the bushes, we'll have to go in and find out who it is immediately," said Pippi to Tommy and Annika. "Come on, let's go in." She walked up to the ticket window. "Can I go in for half price if I promise to look with only one eye?" she asked with a sudden attack of economy. But the ticket seller wouldn't hear anything like that. "I don't see any bushes and no one to sneak around in them either," said Pippi disgustedly when she and Tommy and Annika had seated themselves on the front bench. "Well, it hasn't started yet," said Tommy. Just then the curtain went up and the Countess Aurora was seen walking back and forth on the stage. She wrung her hands and looked worried. Pippi followed every move with breathless interest. She must feel sad, she said to Tommy and Annika, or maybe she has a safety pin that's sticking her someplace. Countess Aurora was feeling sad. She raised her eyes to the ceiling and said in a plaintive voice, "Is there anyone as unhappy as I? My children were taken away from me, my husband disappeared, and I myself am surrounded by villains and bandits who want to kill me." "Oh, how terrible it is to hear this," said Pippi, whose eyes were getting red. "I wish I were dead already," said the Countess Aurora. Pippi burst out crying. "Please don't talk like that," she sniffed. "Things will get brighter for you. The children will find their way home and, well, you can always get another husband. There are so many men," she gasped between her sobs. The manager of the show, the one who had stood outside, came up to Pippi and told her that if she didn't keep absolutely quiet, she would have to leave the theater at once. "I'll try," said Pippi, wiping her eyes. Well, the play was terribly exciting. Tommy sat through it all, twisting and turning his cap from sheer nervousness. Annika held her hands tightly clasped in her lap. Pippi's bright eyes didn't leave Countess Aurora a minute. Things were growing worse and worse for the poor countess. She walked in the palace garden, suspecting nothing. Suddenly there was a loud cry. It was Pippi. She had seen a man hiding behind a tree, and he didn't look like a kind man. Countess Aurora must have heard something rustling, for she said in a frightened voice, "Who's sneaking around in the bushes?" "I can tell you," said Pippi excitedly. "It's a horrible man with a black mustache. Run into the woodshed and lock the door, quick." The manager came up to Pippi and said she must leave at once. "And leave the Countess Aurora alone with that horrid man?" "You don't know me, mister," answered Pippi. On stage, the play went on. Suddenly, the horrid man sprang from the bushes and threw himself at the Countess Aurora. "Ah, your last hour has come," he hissed. "Oh, it has it?" cried Pippi. "We'll see about that." And with one jump, she was on stage. Grabbing the villain around the waist, she threw him across the footlights onto the floor of the auditorium. She was still crying. "How can you?" she sobbed. "What have you got against the Countess anyway? Remember that her children and her husband have left her, and she's all alone." She went up to the Countess, who had sunk down on the garden seat, completely exhausted. "You can come and live with me in Villa Villaquela if you want to," Pippi said comfortingly. Sobbing loudly, Pippi stumbled out of the theater, followed by Tommy and Annika and the manager. He shook his fist after Pippi, but the people in the audience clapped their hands and thought she had given a good performance. Outside, Pippi blew her nose and, quickly regaining her composure, said, well, come, we'll have to cheer up. This was too sad." "The menagerie," said Tommy. "We haven't been to the menagerie." On their way to the menagerie, they stopped at a sandwich stand, and Pippi bought 6 sandwiches for each of them and 3 big bottles of soda. "Crying always makes me so hungry," explained Pippi. There were many things to see inside the menagerie. An elephant and 2 tigers in a cage, and several large trained seals that were throwing a ball to one another, and a whole lot of monkeys, and a hyena and 2 giant snakes. Pippi took Mr. Nilsson over to the monkey cage so that he could speak to his relatives. An old chimpanzee sat there looking very sad. "Come on, Mr. Nilsson," said Pippi. "Speak up nicely now. I imagine this is your grandfather's cousin's aunt's mother-in-law's nephew." Mr. Nilsson doffed his straw hat and spoke as politely as he knew how, but the chimpanzee didn't bother to answer. The 2 giant snakes lay in a big box. Every hour, the beautiful snake charmer, Mademoiselle Paula, took them from their box and did an act with them on the stage. The children were lucky, for they had come in just in time for the performance. Annika was so afraid of snakes that she held tightly to Pippi's arm. Mademoiselle Paula lifted one of the snakes up, a big, ugly thing, and put it around her neck like a scarf. "That looks like a boa constrictor," whispered Pippi to Tommy and Annika. "I wonder what kind the other one is." Pippi went over to the box and lifted up the other snake. It was still larger and uglier. Pippi put it around her neck, just as Mademoiselle Paula had done. All the people in the menagerie cried out in horror. Mademoiselle Paula threw her snake into the box and rushed over to try to save Pippi from certain death. Pippi Snake was frightened and angry from the noise, and he couldn't at all understand why he should be hanging around the neck of a little red-headed girl instead of around Mademoiselle Paula's neck, as he was used to doing. He decided to teach the little red-haired girl a lesson and contracted his body in a grip that would ordinarily choke an ox. "Psh, don't try that old trick on me," said Pippi. "I've seen larger snakes than you know, in farthest India." She pulled the snake away from her throat and put him back into the box. Tommy and Annika stood there, pale with fright. "That was a boa constrictor too," said Pippi, fastening one of her garters that had come loose, "just as I thought." Mademoiselle Paula scolded her for several minutes in some foreign language, and all the people in the menagerie drew a long breath in relief, but their relief was short-lived, for this was evidently a day when things happened. Afterward, no one knew just how the next thing had happened. The tigers had been fed large red chunks of meat, and the keeper said he was sure he had locked the door of the cage, but a minute later a terrible cry was heard. "A tiger is loose!" It was. There, outside the cage, lay the yellow striped beast ready to spring. The people fled in all directions, all but one little girl who stood squeezed in a corner right next to the tiger. "Stand perfectly still," the people called to her. They hoped the tiger would not touch her if she didn't move. "What shall we do?" they cried, wringing their hands. "Run for the police," someone suggested. "Call the fire department," cried another. "Oh, bring Pippi Longstocking," cried Pippi. I thought it was Pippi in the corner, but it's not. "Bring Pippi Longstocking," cried Pippi, and stepped forward. She squatted a couple of yards from the tiger and called to him, "Pussy, pussy, here, pussy, pussy." The tiger growled ferociously and showed his enormous teeth. Pippi held up a warning finger. "If you bite me, I'll bite you. You can be sure of that." And look, you can see she's holding her hat, and you can see her fancy dress, telling that tiger that she'll bite him. Then the tiger sprang right at her. "What's this? Don't you understand a joke?" cried Pippi, and she pushed the tiger away. With a loud snarl that made cold shivers go up and down everyone's back, the tiger threw himself at Pippi a second time. You could plainly see that he intended to bite her throat. "So you want to fight, eh?" said Pippi. "Well, just remember that it was you who started it." With one hand, she pressed together the huge jaws of the tiger, picked him up, and cradling him in her arms, tenderly carried him back to the cage, singing a little song. "You see my little kitty, little kitty, little kitty." The people drew a sigh of relief for a second time, and the little girl, who had stood squeezed into the corner, ran to her mother and said she never wanted to go to a menagerie again. The tiger had torn the hem of Pippi's dress. Pippi looked at the rags and said, "Does anybody have a pair of scissors?" Madam, bless you. Mademoiselle Paula had a pair, and she wasn't angry with Pippi anymore. "Here you are, brave little girl," she said, and gave Pippi the scissors. Pippi cut her dress off a few inches above the knees. "There," she said happily. "Now I'm finer than ever. My dress is cut low at the neck and high at the knees. You really couldn't find a finer dress." She tripped off so elegantly that her knees hit each other at every step. "Charming," she said. You would have thought that there had been enough excitement for one day at the fair, but fairs are never very quiet places, and it was soon evident that the people had again drawn their breath of relief in too soon. In the town lived a very bad man, a very strong bad man. All the children were afraid of him, and not only the children, but everyone else too. Even the police preferred to stay out of the way when the bad man, Laban, maybe is his name, was on the warpath. He wasn't angry all the time, only when he had drunk ale, and he had had quite a bit of ale the day of the fair. Yelling and bellowing, he came down Main Street, swinging his huge arms. "Out of the way," he cried. "Here comes Laban." The people anxiously backed up against the walls, and many children cried in terror. There was no police officer in sight. Laban made his way toward the carnival. He was terrible to look at, with his long hair hanging down low over his forehead, his big red nose, and one yellow tooth sticking out of his mouth. The crowd at the carnival thought that he looked even more ferocious than the tiger. A little old man stood in a booth selling hot dogs. Laban went up to the booth, struck his fist on the counter, and yelled, "Give me a hot dog and be quick about it." The old man gave him a hot dog at once. "That will be 50 cents, he said timidly. "Do you charge for a hot dog when you serve it to such a fine gentleman as Laban? Aren't you ashamed of yourself? Hand me over another one." The old man said that first he must have money for the one that Laban had already eaten. Then Laban took hold of the man's ears and shook him. "Hand over another hot dog," he demanded, "this instant." The old man didn't dare disobey, but the people who stood around couldn't help muttering disapprovingly. One was even brave enough to say, "It's disgraceful to treat a poor old man like that." Laban turned around. He looked at the crowd with his bloodshot eyes. "Did someone sneeze?" he sneered. The crowd sensed trouble and wanted to leave. "Stand still," shouted Laban. "I'll bash in the head of the first one who moves. Stand still, I say, for Laban will now give a little show." He took a whole handful of hot dogs and began to juggle them. He threw them in the air and caught some of them in his mouth and some in his hands, but several fell on the ground. The poor old hot dog man almost cried. Suddenly, a little form darted out of the crowd. Pippi stopped right in front of Laban. "Ah, whose little boy can this be?" she asked sweetly. "And what will his mommy say when he throws his breakfast around like this?" Laban gave a terrifying growl. "Didn't I say that everyone should stand still?" he shouted. "Do you always turn on the loudspeaker?" wondered Pippi. Laban raised a threatening fist and yelled, "Brat! Do I have to make hash out of you before you shut up?" Pippi stood with her hands at her sides and looked at him with interest. "What was it you did to the hot dogs? Was it this?" She threw Laban high up into the air and juggled him for a few minutes. The people cheered. The old man clapped his hair and smiled. When Pippi had finished, a very much frightened and confused Laban sat on the ground looking around. "Now I think the bad man should go home," said Pippi. Laban had no objection. "But before you go, there are some hot dogs to be paid for," said Pippi. Laban stood up and paid for 18 hot dogs, and then he left without a word. He was never quite himself after that day. "3 cheers for Pippi," cried the people. "Hooray for Pippi," cried Tommy and Annika. "We don't need a police officer in this town," somebody said, "as long as we have Pippi Longstocking." "No, sir," said someone else. "She takes care of both tigers and bad men." "Of course we have to have a police officer," said Pippi. "Someone has to see to it that the bicycles stand decently parked in the wrong places." "Oh, Pippi, you were wonderful," said Annika, as the children walked home from the fair. "Oh, yes, charming," said Pippi. She held up her skirt, which already came only halfway to her knees. "Really, most charming." Here is a picture of her throwing Laban in the air. So there's her throwing him in her hat and her shorter dress. And there's Laban up in the air. And that is the end of chapter 5.